Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our webinar today. I'm Nathan Mitchell, a board member with CAMA Manitoba, and I work with Glacier Farm Media. It looks like another great turnout for today's webinar. Thank you for all your support. We have a few non-CAMA members with us today, and we encourage you to go out and check our new website at cama.org for more information on how to join your local chapter. CAMA has just launched their new name, and we are now known as the Canadian Agri-food Marketers Alliance. Make sure to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Each of the provincial chapters work hard to provide the opportunity for members to connect with our agri-food marketers to grow their skills and their passion for marketing and communications. By becoming a member, you can also reap those benefits. We'd also like to acknowledge and recognize our industry partners who have joined the CAMA National Sustaining Partner Program. These inaugural partners are committed to our ongoing focus and ensuring CAMA continues to be a dynamic, credible, and relevant organization for Canada's agri-food marketers and communicators. Our 5 committed partners are AdFarm, AGI, Bayer, Glacier Farm Media, and Real Agriculture. Thank you to those companies for their ongoing support. Before I turn it over to our guest speaker, we have a few housekeeping items to review. Please keep your camera off and muted during this presentation. If there are questions, please type them in the chat box in the control panel. There will be a short Q&A session at the end of our presentation. This webinar will be recorded and the link will be emailed to all participants within 24 hours. We will also be sending all participants a follow-up survey to gather your input on today's event and to obtain feedback for future CAMA events. Now back to the webinar. I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, who has many roots in Manitoba. Breanne Kielich is responsible for shaping TELUS Agriculture's global brand and marketing presence. Prior to joining TELUS Agriculture in 2019, Breanne led marketing efforts for Farm at Hand, FarmLink Marketing Solutions, and the Grain World Conference. Before that, Breanne spent time at ThinkShift working on brand building and campaign development for key agricultural accounts. Breanne holds a Bachelor of Commerce in Marketing and International Business from the University of Manitoba. Breanne, welcome and thank you for today's presentation.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to sharing things, and with how many familiar names there are on the list today, it's really cool. I hope that eventually we all get to do this in person instead of virtually, but virtually also allows me to be on vacation while I do this. So apologies if there are any technical issues. I cannot blame the TELUS network because, as you can see, I'm definitely not in Canada right now. But thanks for joining today. And I'm really excited about how much interest there is to hear about TELUS Agriculture's adventures and how we came to be. And I think the big question on everybody's mind, and certainly the big question that was on my mind before I started, is what is TELUS doing in agriculture? It doesn't seem like a very logical step for a telco, but the reality is that TELUS is actually a bit different than other telcos. And instead of choosing to diversify into areas like sports and entertainment, we look at areas of social purpose. And the first time that TELUS did this was about 10 years ago with TELUS Health, where they looked at how you digitize electronic medical records to help create better health outcomes by having a better flow of information across the system and removing data silos. And since then, we've picked to diversify into agriculture. And while that might not seem like a very common thing to go between health and agriculture, there's actually a lot of similarities between the two industries. Primarily, if you look at the products that we have within the health side of it and the agriculture side of it, there's a high degree of collaboration that's required to get to an end product. So a lot of different players within the system that work together to have that output. There's a lot of regulation that's involved in it. There's a lot of investment in terms of chemistry and research and development. And there's also a lot of personal sensitivity. So if you think about the food that we put in us and the medicine and the technology from healthcare's perspective, it's all very closely tied to consumers and very sensitive. The other piece that I think is really interesting, and not one that I would have naturally drawn a conclusion of, is the similarities between the producer and the farmer and the physician. So when you think about farmers and doctors, you don't often think, hey, these guys or gals are very similar. You think they're very different. But the reality is they're both small business owners, and they're both the key points of digitization and key points of input rather within their respective supply chains. So making sure that that information comes to be is really important. And as you can imagine, with a lot of small businesses, people don't necessarily have the capacity to take on an entire tech department like some of the partners upstream and downstream from them in the value chain. So there have been challenges with both industries in terms of how we digitize that and how we support those individuals in that process. There's also a lot of really heavy reporting requirements that come into that. So when you look at TELUS's mission, and it's that we believe in using technology and human compassion to create remarkable human outcomes, you kind of get a better sense of why agriculture and health might be a good fit for us. And the ways that tech that's available within a traditional telco can actually be used to apply transformation within industries where there's a high degree of collaboration that's required. So you have all of these different players. Some of them are quite large, some of them are smaller, and they're all struggling with different pieces. So it requires a different degree of coordination and a different degree of transformation than what you might see with other areas of disruption, like for example, with the taxi industry and Uber. It's a little bit more closed than what it is when you look at healthcare or the food system. So when we actually look at the challenges facing the food system, it became really clear that, these aren't small pieces. It's how do we feed 10 billion more people on the same amount of land and with a lower carbon footprint, which, those are just small tasks for a Wednesday morning. And what TELUS really saw was an opportunity for us to make a difference. So yes, there's the capitalist side of it, but there's also the social outcome of it, which is really important to our organization, both in areas that we diversify into and the way that we conduct our business. So I think that, it's really our goal to help make that more efficient as a process in general. So that is where TELUS Agriculture was born. And it actually came out of a capstone project of an MBA that was done by my colleague, Mike Dietrich, about 4 years ago. And they presented that to the CEO of TELUS, and he's like, this is so cool. It's a great fit with where we want to go as an organization, where we're already choosing to diversify, and where we see there's a lot of growth and impact that we can make for the positive. So we are now doing our part to connect the food value system using different forms of technology to help build a more efficient system. So looking our mission as part of a subset of TELUS is tackling one of the most significant social challenges of our generation, in that feeding the world at the same time as we improve our food quality and safety through technology and human compassion. So what does that actually look like? It looks like connecting that value system. And when we think about what that means, it's 3 pillars for us. So we look at the digitization side of it, like I mentioned before, looking at the similarities between the producer and the doctor, how we connect them, and then how we create a better exchange of information. So we have a number of different audiences. Obviously, the food system is quite vast. And it's really looking at how do we use shareable insights and data and different forms of technology to help enable their businesses. So if we think about egg input manufacturers, how do we reduce takebacks and do a better job of forecasting demand? If we think about farmers and ranchers, how do we increase productivity and the output and the profitability of that, while at the same time creating new opportunities further downstream through the supply chain and looking at different ways that they can connect more there. If we think about manufacturers, distributors, and processors, how do we improve the sustainability of the sourcing, right? How do we make that more traceable? How do we make sure that, from a logistics standpoint, we're reducing waste where we can and using technology that's going to give us insights about the 15% of the food that's actually wasted within the supply chain. And then also looking at the marketing side of it downstream when we think about consumer goods companies and the retail side of it and the demand generation and doing a better prediction from the consumer side of it all the way through so that we have better insights and a more efficient way of working. So when we started, we were a small team, and by small, I mean small. We were very much a startup within TELUS. I think that there were 12 people when I first joined almost 3 years ago. And we each had kind of our own lane that we were working in to help build the strategy around what that looks like. And we knew from the hop, and we're a little different than some of TELUS's other diversification, that we were going to start by amassing assets. So a heavy acquisition strategy. And the first of which was very familiar to me in that it was farm at hand. And at that point, I was already with TELUS and really excited to get our original team back together, the band. And for us, it was really important to have that foundational asset, specifically at that key point of digitization when we look at the farmer side of it and row crop especially, and understand what that meant so that we could better inform our strategy. So from there, our team amassed an additional 10 companies from across the food value chain, and ranging from people who look at trade promotion management for CPG companies to animal health organizations focusing on individual cow-calf operations or feedlots, people who look at API integrations. So we help normalize the flow of information from different sources of input like machinery into farm management systems. We have an organization that looks at supply chain management and sourcing from that perspective, looking at quality controls and compliance and all the different pieces there that help kind of that pivotal point between a producer and the rest of the food supply as it goes into processing. So it has been a very busy almost 3 years. And now we're really excited because we have what we feel is a very differentiated set of solutions that we are stitching together, which is no small task, and it's not something that's done overnight. But we have over 1,500 experts from around the globe, with over 6,000 customers in different countries that are helping us do that. So we think that it's a really unique way to look at something that, historically, and I think it's so cool that CAMA is looking at themselves now as the agri-food side of it, because I think one of our biggest challenges as the food system is not thinking about ourselves like a food system and thinking about ourselves in a more siloed fashion, pardon the pun, but really looking at it from a, holistically, how do we make this better? Because if we look at how do we make each individual point better, that's great. But eventually we have to stitch it all together so that it can be work together. So as you can imagine, from a marketing perspective, it poses a bunch of challenges when the companies that you work with range from PepsiCo to an egg retailer in southwestern Saskatchewan. So it's been a very interesting ride in terms of a brand and marketing perspective, in terms of building the infrastructure and the foundation for how we actually execute on that. So when we started, we had a really, really great jumping off point in the TELUS brand. So obviously TELUS is one of Canada's most recognized and valuable brands. I remind our team that it is an $8.2 billion asset frequently, and I'm sure they're tired of hearing that. But there's this voice in the back of my head that's constantly saying, don't screw it up, don't screw it up. But it really was a really great foundation to start from. And it was a foundation, but at the same point, we were kind of building from scratch. So as I mentioned before, with TELUS Agriculture, we were amassing a bunch of different smaller assets, which is very different than how TELUS had moved into healthcare or how we'd moved into international. And with health, we had a larger organization that we pulled in. There was a lot of the infrastructure that was already in place. But with agriculture, we were really building from the ground up. And when I say from the ground up, I mean from the logo up. So it was definitely an interesting experience building within a brand, and not without its challenges. And I'd say the biggest challenge that we faced in terms of how we look at these pieces and some of the the bigger roadblocks that we came through or whatnot was the idea of the chicken and the egg. Because when you have nothing and you know that you're going to need everything in a very short time span because you're pulling all of this together and wanting to go to market as one brand, you learn very quickly how to prioritize and how to approach those pieces. And for us, it was really about keeping two goals top of mind. So the first goal being we have to get to a point where we're ready to launch. And then the second goal being eventually we're going to have this global presence in the market that we need to be able to enable. So our approach for how we looked at marketing and all the different systems and everything that underpins that and the brand has been very much, like we need a brand strategy that is going to manage what we're doing today, but also leave growth room for where we're going in the future. We need a website that's going to get us to launch and communicate what we're doing now. And then also look at building the infrastructure for where we're going and how you stitch 11 companies and over 100 solutions with, maybe probably 15 to 20 different audiences together. Same thing in terms of your visual assets and your identity and the standards that go along with that. We needed a baseline for, okay, these are kind of the fence posts for what TELUS's agriculture presence looks like, because I can tell you that when we first started doing photo shoots and whatnot with our lovely team at TELUS Studios, they wanted to turn a tractor purple, and I was like, no, that's not really a thing. And like, maybe as a joke one year, but just really building those standards of a baseline, and then looking at how you develop the visual toolkit and assets that are actually going to enable a global brand. So a lot of different balances. And then the second or the last piece of that is really, how do you manage the transition, right? So when we think about how do you harmonize and bring those brands together, what does that look like in the short term versus what does that look like in the long term? And we chose an attribution model. So looking at the Buy TELUS Agriculture, which you'll see on a lot of our organizations today, and then looking at some more in-depth plans for how we're going to start to go to market as one organization in the future. So when we think about our launch, there was a lot of stuff that had to happen ahead of this. So as I mentioned, when I started, we didn't have a logo, and we also didn't have any companies. So we set a number of criteria, both as TELUS proper from our team at Ventures and the corporate development team and the investor relations team, for what would this look like when we're ready to launch. So we're looking at different market conditions. We're looking at the size and breadth of our offering. We're looking at the diversification of our strategy. How different were we from what else was in the market? Because we wanted to make a real splash and show the industry that we were very serious about what we were doing. So at the onset of it, we were actually quite quiet about our acquisitions. And I know there's a lot of mystery that built up around that. And that was intentional as well, to make sure that, we were ready to say, this is who we're going to be, instead of the individual pieces as well. So our launch happened in the middle of a pandemic, which was a very interesting experience. So obviously it was a virtual event where we had a lot of very strong earned and owned strategies around it. So we did a lot of pre-embargo pitching and interviews and outreach to our media partners. There was an op-ed and sponsored content that went out. We had a really great network from our acquisitions, and then also from our TELUS team of different stakeholders within government and the industry and our customer base that we did a lot of outreach to before as well. We did a little bit of paid media, and then we looked at how do we start to actually launch some of our digital footprint as well. And then for the actual virtual event, we had a lot of people that were invited ahead of time, and we had a really great brand video and testimonials, followed up by a question and answer session with our executive leadership team. And I think it was a really interesting experience that I learned a lot from, and that our team learned a lot from. I think the first piece of that would be the be flexible side of it. So especially in a pandemic, but I mean, I can tell you that our date changed probably about 5 times in the span of 3 years, or 2 years actually at that point. And being flexible in terms of changing conditions and everything that went around that, from not only just the marketing side of it and where things were shifting, but also from a business perspective. So building into your plans the contingency that things are going to go wrong, what's plan B, what's the backup, and constantly being able to look like a couple of steps ahead to make sure that we had visibility as to where things were going, and staying close to our partners in corporate development and the strategy team to make sure that we are very apprised of what was going on. The second piece is be Beyonce, which I mentioned a bit before. We spoke when we had something really interesting to say, which I think is a really great strategy that a number of artists are employing now within the music industry, and kind of creating some of that mystery and making it really significant when you have something to say. And when we went to market, we had, I think at that point we were 9 acquisitions. and a pretty amazing, I think we were 9 acquisitions, 1,200 staff, and a pretty significant global footprint. So it was a really interesting story to be able to finally answer the question, what is TELUS doing buying all these agriculture companies? Which leads to the next piece, which is also keeping the big picture in mind. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure was that we were setting up a proper foundation for building the brand after launch as well. And not only building the TELUS agriculture brand, but also how we contribute back into the TELUS brand. So we work really closely with TELUS's master brand team to identify, how we're going to ladder into the overarching TELUS brand architecture and what that means from a messaging hierarchy perspective, and how we start to shift narrative around from TELUS being a telco to being a really diversified social purpose company that invests into these areas where we can impact change in a significant manner. Leverage what you do have. So a lot of people, and it kind of feeds into choose where to splurge. A lot of people think TELUS and they think, wow, they must have an amazingly huge budget. And we don't. Our parents have money. We are the children and we're the youngest in the family. So we have a couple hand-me-downs. So for us, it was really about, making sure that we could leverage what was in our toolkit. So we had the fact that we were mysterious. We had the fact that, we had a really amazing global footprint and a lot of very strong relationships. We had the power of the TELUS brand behind us as well, which opens a lot of doors. So that was a really important part of our strategy in terms of how we approached what we were going to do. We also were very intentional about choosing where we were going to splurge. So like I mentioned, we didn't have a lot of money to pull this off. And for us, we chose to really splurge on the emotional side of it. So launching a brand is a fairly, connected point where you're trying to resonate with people from a human perspective. And for us, the best way to do that was through video. So how else to tell your story than by creating that emotional connection there. So that was really important for us. And the last piece is less about, launching a brand, more about launching a massive project. So this is something that my boss, who is our VP of Global Strategy, has been really, really driving home, is the idea of widening the tent. So I think a lot of us sometimes try and do stuff on our own. But for this, we had over 20 teams from different cross-functional areas inside of TELUS and outside of TELUS. And it was really important to our strategy that we had people who could take things and own them and go away and really make them sing. We think we should have probably had more project management involved with it. It was a very stressful time period, but definitely rewarding, and actually had some pretty amazing results. So we actually were the most successful launch that TELUS has ever seen. So we had the top media sentiment and positivity scores. This is my brag slide, so apologies in advance. We had over 250,000 impressions in terms of social media, web views, and our video as well. We had 2,000 people attend from all over the world in 26 countries, and some fairly significant attendees from different influential organizations. So the other piece I think was really cool about it is the media coverage that came out of it. And beyond the media coverage, for a publicly traded company, the other piece that we're always trying to keep in mind is obviously the shareholder sentiment and the investor perception. And that was a very positive outcome from what we were able to achieve as well. So what does it mean in terms of how you build a brand and integrate all these different organizations at the same time? I will say it is a giant mountain to climb. And the best way that I found to explain it is through analogies, again, probably to the chagrin of our team. But it's very much like you're building a plane as you're flying it. And it's a huge, huge mountain. And the way that I explain kind of what that process looks like is we start by needing to build a container. So we have this house that we're building, and that includes everything from our website, our brand strategy, all the visual standards, the processes, the guidelines, all the assets, the tools, and everything that you need for everybody to live in a house. It's like the Brady Bunch. And then you actually have to move people into the house. So you have, your SEO migration strategy, you have, your transition plans, how you're telling customers, all the different systems and tools that you actually need to have in place. And I think one of the things that we frequently think about is like, okay, we have this brand harmonization side of it, but we also have all of the different pieces from an organizational lens that have to filter into that as well. All the details like invoicing and whatnot. And then the third bucket here is inviting people to the house party once the house is up and we've got the people in it. And like I mentioned before, this is very much a chicken and an egg situation. So we are doing brand marketing at the same time as we're building the house, as at the same time as we're transitioning the brands. So all the different components that actually make that happen. And we definitely are not getting it all right. So I'd say we have a lot of learnings that we can share from that as well. The biggest pieces here, I would say, are around building a relationship. So again, similar to what we had from launch, not being able to do it alone and understanding where it's important to scale up and scale down, depending on what your needs are for that piece. So we have a number of really amazing trusted partners. Our digital agency of record is Nascent Digital out of Toronto. They have been absolutely fundamental in helping us figure out what our second phase of our website looks like in terms of how you organize all those different audiences and all the different solutions, and what that looks like. And I think, building on that, the digital first piece here, building digital first, especially when you're a tech company, is really important. But it's also a great tactic from a marketing lens. So if you think of a website almost as a catalyst for all the different pieces that need to happen, it'll tell you what types of image standards you need. It'll tell you what types of copy standards you need for the way that you write about things, the way that you talk about value propositions, even the way that you organize your solutions and your audiences, which has been very collaborative with our product and sales teams. But to kind of get to a point where your site structure becomes that visual representation of what everybody's talking about behind the scenes is a great way to help people get on board and see kind of where you're going. Getting your hands dirty. I think on the farm and hand slide, there was a picture of a flax flower that was color corrected to be purple. I quite literally mean getting your hands dirty. I dug that one out of the ground outside of Portage la Prairie, Manitoba about 2 years ago on Canada Day. So I think one of the things that's really important is when you're trying to build processes or standards or anything, is not being afraid to really understand things at their root. And there are so many puns in here, so I'm so sorry. But it's really like knowing what you need in that sense in that time, and not being afraid to step into that role. And I think by stepping into those roles and digging in and kind of deconstructing pieces as they are, challenging the status quo of the processes, understanding how things work from whether it's a digital perspective, a social perspective, the process for how you manage events. Sometimes you break the system before you can actually rebuild it, but then at least you actually know what's happening. So I think having that intimate knowledge of how things work is really important, not only from a marketing process side of things, but also from a product perspective. And I firmly believe that, one of the things that makes marketing successful is really understanding what problems you're solving and working back very closely with the product team on what that customer journey is and how to affect people's decision-making processes differently based off of how you're going to market. Prioritizing where you spend and those different investments. So for us, it was really important, I talked about the chicken and the egg. It was really important for us to understand what the big rocks were, because a lot of times, marketing's kind of an afterthought, or like, oh yeah, we'll just go build a website. And all of you know that just go building a website is not an easy thing, and it takes a lot of work. So really diving into kind of where the big rocks are, making sure that we have those key points of infrastructure in place and prioritizing those first. So if it's visual guidelines, or if it's your brand strategy and kind of the geographic understanding of where you're going, I think are some really key points for our organization, and understanding how you do that. Because I think, pretty often we try and boil the ocean, and the reality is that that's not always feasible, and we don't have unlimited resources no matter who we are. And actually, I think it's more interesting when you have limited resources, because you come up with more creative solutions to the problems. So I think that getting really clear on what what the immediate term goals are and what some of the longer term pieces are is really critical for creating focus on a smaller team as well. And I would say even more so from a marketing perspective. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like marketing is frequently tasked with a lot of stuff that is maybe not marketing. And people always have requests and different pieces that come through. So it also helps create a lot of fence posts around what we're focusing on, and by creating that focus, making sure that you can actually be successful in those things and be able to do them well. So other people's priorities might not be the big pieces of what we need to get done at that point. Listening to partner insights. So especially when you're building a global brand across so many different audiences that sometimes you know nothing about, it's really important to, pull in expertise from different areas, whether that's, your SEO partners or your partners in the UK who will tell you that they have no idea what ranch means. And that if we say ranchers here, we understand what that is. But they don't even have ranch dressing. So a lot of really interesting insights and pieces that you can pull from the people around you. So even if you're not using them at that point in time or that specific day, making the space and factoring those into those longer term plans, because they're going to become really important down the line when you start to layer some of that in. And I think the last one kind of speaks to the prioritization piece of it, but it's knowing which rules to break and which rules to keep. So one of the things that I think is interesting when you start building a startup within a $8.2 billion brand is, there's a lot of rules and there's a lot of golden handcuffs that come along with that. But really being able to identify, and work with the teams that are there and, building relationships. We work really closely with TELUS Studios and our master brand team and the digital teams to know how we actually have to evolve the organization as well. So part of what our team works on really closely is the evolution of the TELUS brand and the evolution of the infrastructure that goes along with that. So there are very valid reasons for a lot of rules to be in place, but as I'm sure any of you who are in larger organizations know, there are also rules that just create a whole lot of hubbub and slow things down a bit. And especially when you have very, time constrained demands and you're working in a fast-paced environment like a startup, you need to move a lot faster than that. So I think it's really important to understand which rules are in place for a reason, whether they're brand standards in the way that you do one thing and how we present ourselves, and where there's, opportunity to either maybe bend the rules a little bit in the short term to make sure that we're getting what we need to get done, or actually blowing up a system a little bit and saying, hey, you know what, we actually need to evolve these standards, and making sure that that's built into the evolution of that as well. So not being rigid and making sure that, we know where we have to be rigid to make sure that we're communicating all the different pieces of the puzzle. So I think I went through that a lot faster than I thought I would. So, Nate, are there any questions that you'd like to ask? I'm happy to go back and answer anything from that.
Yeah, there was actually a few questions that came through the chat, Breanne, so I can throw those out to you now if you like.
Sure.
Okay, great. And thank you again. That was a great presentation and much appreciated taking the time to do that for us.
Happy to.
Okay, so the first one, it would have been a little earlier in the presentation, so just to give you a bit of context, but someone just commented that they've got a food background and they were curious to know more about your comment regarding the use of technology to reduce food waste.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I think that, like, if you look at the some of the statistics on where waste happens within the food system, 30% of all food is wasted, and 15% of that actually happens within the supply chain. And that's in a variety of different areas. But I think one of the places that's really interesting to us is looking at the cold chain. So if we have highly perishable, high value crops like strawberries, for example, how do we look at different technologies that we can employ to help extend the shelf life when they get to a retailer? Because if we think about, the food waste that happens, let's say strawberries spoil because, and this is actually a study that we conducted in Australia, where we found by using nanotechnology that for one of our retail customers, the trucks that were shipping from a farmer, a strawberry farmer, all the way to the store, or the processor rather, the trucks were turning the cooling off for about, like half of the transport time, and that actually reduced the shelf life by 2 days. So, they're probably thinking, yeah, wow, that's amazing, we can save energy while we're transporting these pieces. But the actual impact of that and the resulting food waste meant that all of the land resources and the water resources and the transport resources that were used to get those strawberries to market were reduced by 2 days, because we couldn't have that happen. So I think when we think about, food waste, we're not just talking about food waste, we're also talking about the impact to our natural resources like water and the land and different components around that. So using technology like nanotechnology and different tags that you can apply through the system there, to help improve that process and give data backed insights, where you can actually say, oh my God, we just need to tell them to keep the coolers on, and have some pretty remarkable outcomes, is where, if we think about, we have, I think UN says it's a 70% increase in food required by 2050. That's a big number, but 15% of it's being wasted. So if we can reduce that 15% that's wasted in the supply chain, we're then that much closer to our goal, and we have massive impacts in terms of sustainability and our carbon footprints as well. So that's one of the areas that we're looking at in that as well.
Okay, great, thanks. And I'll mention it again, if anyone does have a question on the call today, we do have a bit of time here, so please feel free to put it into the chat box on the bottom of your screen, and we'll get Breanne to answer those. But Breanne, there was another question that came up earlier, and the person just mentions that they're not an expert in blockchain technology by any means, but they wanted to know with TELUS, is this a major component or infrastructure for TELUS's goal of connecting with the agri-food chain, using that blockchain technology?
That's a really good question. And I think it's one of the tools that we're looking to use. I don't know that it's the tool that we're looking to use. And the way that we like to approach this is very much from a problems to be solved perspective. So if there are specific solutions that are best suited by blockchain, by using that. But I think a lot of times, in general, we get really excited about AI or blockchain or all these other pieces. And for us, it's really important to drive back to the specific pain point in the problem that we're solving. So yes, I do think blockchain will be a component of the technology stack that we use. But I think that, we tend to look at some of those pieces more holistically around what's the best technology that we can use. And sometimes it's really, what we would call rudimentary technology, like, that can drive really important outcomes that way. So I would say yes, with a caveat.
Okay, fantastic. And there's a couple more here. So one would be, how are you educating people that TELUS is more than a telco?
That is a really good question. So by doing things like this and talking to people about, what we're doing within agriculture is a really important piece. As I mentioned before, it's the same for how we work with our master brand team, and changing how we talk about stuff. So actually, you'll probably start to see some messaging from TELUS that has expanded beyond what we currently have in the market, to include a larger focus on health and agriculture, to start to expand people's understanding and awareness of what TELUS actually does in the marketplace. And I think as you see, and I'm not sure if it's available in Manitoba yet, it is in BC, and I think in Alberta, but Babylon by TELUS Health, or actually I think it's TELUS Health MyCare now, is a great example of where you're starting to see more consumer related solutions tied to some of our organizations like TELUS Health and TELUS Agriculture that are the diversified part of our strategy. So I expect that those will continue to grow and expand the way that people start to think about TELUS.
Great. There's a few more questions that just came in here, Breanne, while you were chatting. So did the move into agriculture include any charitable investments?
It wasn't so much of a charitable investment, but we had a $1 million investment with our partnership rather with the Olds College Smart Farm. So that is a really key component to how we kicked off on our strategy. So I mentioned before that Farm at Hand was really foundational for us. And the partnership with Olds College was also, it was really important for us, not only from a agriculture perspective, but also from a telco perspective, to get a living lab where we could actually test the different solutions in real time, in real scenarios, in real areas where there is no coverage on a farm, to make sure that we're building things that are farm proof, or farm rugged rather, to make sure that we're testing those pieces. So that was the number one priority. As I mentioned before, we don't have a ton of cash, but we are looking at a number of different charitable and different partnerships as TELUS and TELUS Agriculture. So one of TELUS's key principles is that we give where we live and where we serve. So being an organization that, I think they have some really amazing programs that, give phones to youth that are just out of foster care and pieces like that. So we are actively looking at areas of community investment to support from a philanthropic perspective, and then also just different programs that we can help use our technology to enable throughout the food system. So it's in progress is my answer to that one.
Okay, great. And there's another good question here. I think this is one that's going to be on a lot of people's minds, especially if they live rurally, but could you please elaborate on connectivity and bandwidth expansion to facilitate data management in a rural farm to store supply chain? Which is, I'm sure you hear this a lot, but great question.
I am not going to pretend to be an expert in data and telco language around different network capabilities and our expansion plans around that. So I'd have to go back to some of our partners within the telco side of things. But I do know that the way that we're investing from a TELUS perspective is heavily influenced by our agriculture strategy. So we are actively looking at intensifying and expanding our coverage within rural areas. That is a massive priority for TELUS. And I think one of the ways that we're looking at that is there's a really great example of it on the Olds College Smart Farm. So where we have, it's called a repeater, and I apologize, I'm going to screw this up. But essentially what it does is it provides, it's kind of like a Wi-Fi extender that's much bigger than a Wi-Fi extender that sits on a pole, and it helps give better coverage into low latency or into low-lying areas that may not get coverage. So that's one way. The other way I think that holds a lot of promise is 5G. So when we look at what 5G can do for low latency networks, where if we have, things like bin sensors or sensors in field like weather stations and things like that. A lot of those pieces are going to be enabled by that technology. And again, I won't claim to understand exactly how it works, but there's a lot of promise, and there's some really great resources on our blog. And if you're interested, I think Neil Van Cedars, who is our VP of product and also has a telco background, and I did a talk on that for the Olds College Ag Smart event this year, which I believe is still live on their account. So you can definitely check out more information from a real expert there. So I'll probably stop and not say something I shouldn't.
Okay, great. And actually there's two more questions here for you, Breanne, unless something else comes in. But, understanding you're a global company, how are you engaging the regional agri-food industry at TELUS?
So I think that one of the most important ways that you can be global is by starting local, right? So our organizations that we've acquired, and I mean, agriculture and food in general and business in general, is highly relationship driven. So really leaning on the expertise that we have on the ground and the relationships that we have in those local areas to understand, what's really important from in those local geographies, to make sure that we're aware of and that we're touching base on and working back from that. So really starting in that whole idea of we give where we live, but we also start where we live, and listening to the team members that we have there and digging into that based off of our global expansion plans.
Awesome, thanks. And this will be the last question for you, unless something comes in while we're talking or you're giving your answer, but it's a good one. I think it's a good place to end. It says, TELUS is known for its critters and advertising. Will TELUS Ag use them as well?
I get that question a lot, and especially from the acquisition teams that come on board. They're like, oh, are we getting a critter? And no, we have made the decision that TELUS Agriculture is not going to use critters. The fallout from the media side of it with people from outside of the ag industry of TELUS has its critters and eats them too is not something that our media relations team or my team really want to manage. And for us, I think, critters are a really wonderful way of connecting from a consumer perspective, but our audiences are really business focused. So lifestyle imagery and being able to incorporate that in a way that we explain what our solutions do and what they enable is a bit more critical for our solutions. But I will say, figuring out how to, show animal health specifically in feedlots has been an interesting challenge to do within the TELUS ecosystem, because we have our critters on one side, so we don't have cow critters, but we do have them in the lifestyle section. So,
Oh, that's perfect. Well, that was it. No more questions, and really appreciate you again, Breanne, taking the time today to put this together for us and give a great presentation to the membership. So thank you very much.
I'm glad to.
And we won't have a speaker gift because you're in a great location. I don't know if you even disclosed where you are today, did you?
I didn't. I'm actually on a farm. I'm on a coffee farm in Hawaii right now. So
yeah. Okay, so the cat's out of the bag now, but you won't be getting a speaker gift, unfortunately, in Hawaii, but we will be making a donation to Agriculture in the Classroom Manitoba on your behalf. So thank you.
Perfect, thank you.
And that wraps up our presentation. So thank you everybody for participating today and supporting CAMA. And if you'd like to learn more about the organization, please take the time to visit the new website at cama.org.